There will never, and I'm sorry dear, ever be anyone who gives hugs like Luke did. He was a happy little fellow. He was so, yeah. Loved his mum.
Oh yeah, loved his mum. He was my little shadow when he was younger.
We were unable to touch him. I couldn't hug him, that's all I needed to do. That's all I had to do. Couldn't do that until we got him back from Canberra to a funeral home.
Karen and Garry's son, Luke Rich, died in an ACT prison one day after he was remanded in custody. He was 27 years old. Luke hung himself from a hanging point on the door of his cell. Prison authorities had been warned that that point could be used for that exact purpose 7 years earlier.
Shockingly, Luke's case is not an outlier. My colleague Ariel and I looked into 248 hanging deaths in every prison system in the country over more than 2 decades. We found that across 19 separate correctional facilities, at least 57 Australians were able to kill themselves using hanging points that prison authorities knew about but failed to remove.
These are just the deaths where we could access the complete coronial findings. There could be far more. In one case, after the hanging death of a young Indigenous man at Tamworth Prison, the New South Wales government told a coroner it could not find any more hanging points that needed removing. A visit by the New South Wales prison inspector less than a year later revealed there were still ligature points in each cell.
In another, we found 10 inmates were able to hang themselves from points in cells at Queensland's Garry Correctional Centre between 2001 and 2020. This was despite warnings from state coroners as early as 2007 that the government immediately fund their removal.
In dozens of cases, prisoners previously deemed at risk of suicide and inmates who had already attempted self-harm in custody were sent into cells with known ligature points. One West Australian coroner found himself making the same recommendation time and time again. He took to copy and pasting the same warning about the desperate need to remove ligature points 3 times in 2 years.
The whole process of admitting anyone into a corrections facility needs an overhaul. People that have made decisions not to repair ligature points, known ligature points, need to be made accountable.
In Luke's case, facilities management at the Correctional Centre wrote to the prison back in 2015, recommending the doors be reviewed and fixed to remove the ligature point. Evidence was given during the inquest that at the time it was decided the point wasn't obvious.
A separate investigation into Luke's death found that ACT Corrective Services was, quote, aware of a serious design fault in the rear cell doors which had been known since 2015. It also failed to properly observe him, among other concerns, and the ACT Inspector of Correctional Services recommended immediate action be taken to make sure the doors were safe.
Luke's family sat through the entire coronial hearing into his death. Karen made a statement at the beginning.
The purpose for that statement was for them to see that Luke was a person, not a detainee and not a number. We don't want this to happen to any other family.
It's not just the families of those who have died who are disturbed by these findings. Former state coroners, justice reform experts and ex-federal ministers told us they're shocked at the astounding failures of successive state governments to remove hanging points following the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody more than 30 years ago.
Suicide by hanging is the most common cause of self-inflicted death in custody, and in recent years, progress to reduce hanging deaths in prison has stalled. In the year to July 2024, there were 19 hanging deaths in Australian prisons, or 1 every 3 weeks. And deaths in custody continue to disproportionately affect Indigenous Australians, who remain vastly overrepresented in prison populations.
When it comes to hanging deaths, ligature points are just one factor. The deaths we investigated often turned out to involve multiple failings. There were breakdowns in psychiatric assessments and a failure to provide proper mental health care. There was also a lack of suitable beds in secure mental health facilities and mistakes in information sharing and cell placement. We spoke with Michael Barnes, the New South Wales Crime Commissioner and former state coroner, who told us that accurately assessing suicide risk can be extremely difficult.
Prisoners as a cohort are at elevated baseline risk compared to the general population for obvious reasons. They're in terrible circumstances, they've got all sorts of upheaval in their life. A high proportion of them suffer from mental illness or personality disorders. They get inadequate access to mental health care, or healthcare generally, but particularly mental health care. And so for all that reason, the whole prison population is at an elevated risk. And that's why hanging points are so important, because you can't identify those with any accuracy who are most likely to harm themselves. You need to make the space that every prisoner occupies at least initially safe.
According to a report by the ACT Custodial Inspector, the cost to replace the cell doors in the prison's management and crisis support units was estimated to be $610,000 back in 2020. Due to budget constraints, the work was never fully completed. In a statement, an ACT government spokesperson told us the hanging point was removed in mid-2022 and the cell doors are under further review. The spokesperson said the ACT government has taken, quote, significant work to identify and remove other hanging points. It's also developed a suicide prevention framework for guards and upgraded cell furniture across the prison to address potential hanging points.
In fact, almost all state and territory governments said the same thing, that they'd spent considerable sums removing hanging points and improving their ability to assess inmates at risk of suicide and provide them with treatment and supervision.
What we would say to the government about this is, you sit there and you tell me that you will not and cannot put a price on life. Guess what? You did. You put a price on my son's life, and it wasn't anywhere near the value of a life. And you are allowing this problem to continue. You put other families and are putting other families through the same ordeal that we're going through. My son just didn't die in a car accident. My son died when you were protecting him. You failed him. You failed him so many times, and you keep doing it. When are you going to make those people, because people made that decision not to spend that money, and now we don't have our son? What are you going to do about it? Enough is enough.